To start the proceedings, we have a number of people who have had experience in dealing with reflections on the senator. I'm going to start by calling to the stage to be the moderator, Dr. Graham Allison. Graham serves on our advisory board as Sam serves on his at the Belfer Center, but it has been a remarkable tour de force to have somebody with that kind of vision and leadership who has impacted as a mentor, as a scholar, and frankly as a friend to a range of people across the globe who have been before the Belfer Center. He stepped down, I guess, a year ago, and Ash Carter now has the job of trying to run the thing. And so he's free at last from the administrative responsibilities, but he is an incredibly valuable person in terms of the policy issues of the day, a thoughtful and reflective scholar, and someone who has been of great assistance to us here at the Nunn School. I call on Dr. Allison.
So it's a great honor for me to be here to participate in this 80th birthday celebration of a great American. And I'm especially happy to see Ted here too, whom I didn't expect I was going to have the opportunity to see. So this is a treat. If I were to try to force to summarize my view of Sam Nunn's unique contributions in one line, I think I would say legendary legislative statesman whose actions actually have made the world a safer place than it would have been without him. So Joe and the organizers asked me to serve as the moderator of a panel and also a member of the panel, each of whom are going to have about 5 minutes to summarize something about Sam Nunn's contributions, including books that have been written and one which is being written, then have a little bit of discussion. But in my panelist role, I was asked to take my 5-minute bite at summarizing a bit about Sam Nunn. And so what I'm going to try to do is ask you to let your imagination expand for a moment, to consider what might have been, what could have been, what would likely have been. And I'm going to focus on one issue, nuclear security. And by nuclear security, I mean the fact that you and I have lived the last 25 years without a single explosion of a nuclear bomb in our country or in any other country that we care about. So history has a very heavy hand. Once we know that something has happened, our imagination shrinks. So if it happened, it probably must have happened. And we therefore fail to appreciate the extent to which some human activity, some actions and choices that individuals made accounted for the difference between what did happen and what could have happened. So let me get you to cast your mind back 27 years ago this fall, 1991. It's the third and next to last year of the George W. Bush administration, Bush 41. Soviet Union is wobbling. Indeed, in August, there had been a coup to try to overthrow Gorbachev. It failed. But the general sense is this place is going to come apart. So, in fact, on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1991, the Soviet Union did disappear. And in its place emerged Russia and 14 newly independent states. So, what could happen? What could have happened? What might have been? Interestingly, in December, the Secretary of Defense at the time, 1991, appeared on Meet the Press. You can go look it up. And the moderator asked him, well, if this country, this nuclear superpower, falls apart, what's going to happen to its nuclear arsenal? Secretary of Defense said, quote, "If the Soviets do an excellent job at retaining control over their stockpile of nuclear weapons, and they are 99% successful, that would mean that you could still have as many as 250 nuclear weapons that they weren't able to control." And he went on to say FedEx might not do better than that. Yeah? So the moderator wasn't deterred. He was a little shocked or a little afraid. He said, well, now, wait a minute. So what can the U.S. do about this? And the Secretary of Defense, you can again look at it, says, I can't think of anything that we can do positively. Quote, "The only realistic thing for me to do as Secretary of Defense is to anticipate that one of the byproducts of the breakup of the Soviet Union will be the proliferation of nuclear weapons." That Secretary of Defense was Dick Cheney, who later was the Vice President under Bush 43. Well, faced with inaction by the administration, somebody else had an idea, a member of Congress, a member of the Senate, Sam Nunn and his colleague Dick Lugar. So they thought of a big, bold idea. They got it passed through the legislative process. This became the Nunn-Lugar legislative program. And over the past 25 years, about $20 billion has been invested in securing weapons that could otherwise have come loose. This included 3,000 long-range missiles that were mainly aimed at places like Atlanta or Boston, some 14,000 tactical nuclear weapons. So what could have been? So if Cheney's forecast had been correct, how many nuclear weapons from the former Soviet Union could have proliferated? And to whom and to where? And what could the consequences have been? I mean, it's hard to imagine, it's hard to believe. But because of imagination and courage and a lot of determination by Sam Nunn and by Dick Lugar and by others, but in particular this legislative initiative, we all have lived in a safer world. So in a book I wrote, a revised edition of Essence of Decision, I said, and I believe, that this is this single most important piece of legislative statecraft in the post-Cold War era. So we're deeply indebted to Sam Nunn, and I thank him very much. So we're fortunate to have three people who worked with Sam over the years and know him well, and they're each going to talk about some part of his contributions from their perspectives. First up is Roland McElroy. Roland spent 15 years working with Sam in the Senate, first as his press secretary and then as his chief of staff, and he's written a book about it. So Roland, come and tell us your short version.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Allison. Yeah, it will be, I promise you, the short version. But listening to Dr. Allison a moment ago, I realized that as I was doing research for my book, the more I got into the background, personal background from way back, I realized that this man has been obsessed with the idea of reducing or ridding the world of nuclear weapons from the very beginning. I think the experience of the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is one of those that was seared on his mind as he traveled for the Vinson Committee overseas and came back. And as the years went by, I remember as he gave speeches, the economy may be going to hell in a handbasket or whatever it was, he would address the subject of the day. But somewhere in that speech before the end of it, he would always come back to the issue of national security and the dangers from the spread of nuclear weapons in the world. But anyway, I want to thank you, Dr. Allison, and to Senator Nunn, those of us who have had the privilege of joining you for even a short period of time on your amazing journey. This is a great honor to be here and to share this great day with you. And to all you believers in Ben Franklin's last and best experiment, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us as well. I want you to pretend for a moment that you are an ambitious young man about 32 years of age. Nobody knows you outside your hometown. He wants to go to Washington to serve in the United States Senate. But when you tell people of your plans, they call you crazy, foolhardy. This is the most ridiculous idea I've ever heard. Hal Gulliver, the editor of the Atlanta Journal, told him face to face at a reception in Atlanta in January of that year, "You're crazy as hell to think you can go up against the Carter machine." Now, this is January of '72, and the primary is in August, and he hasn't even announced yet. But somebody else I remember said, "You have about as much chance to win a seat in the United States Senate as George McGovern has winning or defeating President Nixon this year." And what would you do? What would you do? Well, you would persist. After you announce your intention to run finally in March of 1972, you take a guy named McElroy with you back to your A-frame residence on the family farm to talk about finally putting together a statewide organization. You hold up a small metal box to him, holds a stack of 3x5 cards, but not very many because I could hear them rattling around inside, and you say, "These are all the people I know in the state of Georgia." Now, by that time, the primary is just 5 months away. The next day, the political editor of the Atlanta Constitution, the morning paper, wrote a column and said, "Sam Nunn's announcement yesterday was the most insignificant political event to take place in Georgia this year." He's still running. He's running as hard as he can, and he's still not getting any traction in that first campaign. A member of his family called and said, "Sam, you could get out now, and you wouldn't hurt your reputation much at all. You could live to run another day." And what would you do? I mean, I have often gone back over these details. You're 4 months away from the August Democratic primary. Don Quixote never tilted at a windmill so ominous as what he was looking at. But you decide to play it out. And by the date of the primary, 14 other candidates have qualified, including a former governor, a former congressman, the current state treasurer, and, of course, the appointed senator appointed by Governor Carter. Would you have been just a little bit disappointed at that point in time, or a little bit discouraged about how little traction and the odds of winning that thing? Not if you're Sam Nunn. He was driven by an intense desire, and the more you hung around him, the more you realized that, to serve in the Congress, either the House or Senate. He wanted to go to Washington and to do the job. As he said to me, not too long after we met, "I've read the Congressional Quarterly for several months, and I think I'm ready to go." You may understand when I tell you this. I remember, I'm going to interject this one little thing. Betty, don't get on me for this. But years later, in 1988, everybody in the world was encouraging him to run for president of the United States. His staff wanted me to call him because he was dragging his feet. They thought he was interested, but he wouldn't say yes. I didn't want to call him because I really knew him well enough to know this was probably not the time. Anyway, we had a nice, quiet conversation. And towards the end, I said, "This is the opposite of 1972, isn't it?" There was a long pause on the phone, and he said, "Yes." He had the interest, but not the fire that he had in '72. In '72, it didn't make any difference what anybody said. He was going to run. There are many lessons to be learned from Sam Nunn's first campaign, and all of them inform our ability to evaluate his 24-year tenure of service in the Senate to Georgia and indeed in the nation. For example, when Sam Nunn ran in 72, he had the support of Coretta Scott King on one side, Lester Maddox on the other, and as we got to October, Julian Bond over here, and who was the other one? George Wallace. Did I say George Wallace? George Wallace came in right at the end. But we're getting close to the election, and I remember every day just being worried, how in the world are we going to hold this odd coalition together? How is this even possible? And then it dawned on me, all of them are looking for the same candidate. All of them are looking for someone who will listen to them, then go to Washington, read, study, learn, think. I'd like to say that to a few of them that are up there now. And then exercise your best judgment for the people of Georgia and indeed for the nation. That's all we should be asking members of Congress to do anyway. And they knew that Sam Nunn would not always vote their way, but they could trust him to go to Washington and master the issues and then be able to explain to them why he voted a certain way. He would and could do that and thus be worthy of their trust. You have to look at the whole career to understand that it was the very definition of public service. When you hear a candidate say, I want to run for an office, whatever it is, and you talk to them for more than 5 minutes and they don't mention those first two words, public service, somewhere in the conversation, then you might want to look for another candidate. Because he didn't go for one issue or one set of agenda items. He went to do public service. Whether they're talking about whether fine-tuning the student loan program, closing health care reimbursement loopholes, preventing the Soviets from stealing our technology. This is back before the Soviets became the Russians and they had the internet, and which made it a lot easier for them to steal it. Reorganizing the Defense Department or coordinating the effort to reduce the number of nuclear weapons, and on it goes. I mean, his idea, the reason that the subject matter runs so far is whatever the subject matter was that was compelling his attention at that moment, it got the full energy of his intellect on it, and the people of Georgia benefited all day, every day from it. His service was always public service, not self-service. He showed us the qualities to look for in candidates today. Everybody wants to run now, and I'm about done. But my cardiologist said the other day in the course of a conversation, if so-and-so can do it, I can. I'm thinking about running for something as well. It was a federal office. And because, I'm smart and I know I'm smarter than the guy who's there now, whatever job it was. And I said, well, you know a lot about repairing somebody's heart. Have you ever seen that part of the heart that is invisible to the naked eye? Because that's something you need to know about as well. When people get ready to run for any office, they need to ask themselves that question. Am I here because of something I need to do for myself, or am I here for public service? I'll stop right there. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much. For another perspective on the topic, Frank Jones, who's a professor at the U.S. Army War College and who's working on a book on Sam Nunn, is going to give us a little historian's perspective. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and it's an honor to be here, sir. I want to thank you for this privilege and for all your attention to my work over the last several years. Coming to Senator Nunn's career, as I did, I had finished a book on the late Robert Comer, and after finishing that book, I had begun to think about how I might approach a different branch of the U.S. government, and I became interested in the Congress. I had served as a legislative fellow for a year or so on the House side, and I spoke to Jim Locker and Jim and I had a conversation. He threw out some names, and I said, there's only one person I'm really interested in writing about, Senator Sam Nunn. I said, I had an opportunity after a 30-year career in the Defense Department to watch him very closely, and I admire him, and I felt that I wanted to write about someone who I respected as a member of Congress. I would be remiss if I didn't at first, and I'm sure some of you will understand this, as Dr. Allison said, I'm a faculty member at the U.S. Army War College, so I have to at least say today that my opinions and expressions today are solely my own. They don't represent the U.S. government or the Defense Department or any other entity of the U.S. government. About 6 years ago, Dana Milbank, the columnist for the Washington Post, wrote an editorial piece in which he decried the lack of giants, and that's the word he used, in the U.S. Senate. He said, those are figures of stature, admired by colleagues, and I quote, whose authority could transcend party and the usual arithmetic of vote counting, end quote. Now, in addition to the revered senators whose portraits hang in the reception room off the Senate floor, Milbank specifically noted 6 esteemed congressional leaders that had served since the 1960s. One of them was Senator Sam Nunn. Now, as Roland has recounted, the first step, of course, in any legislative career or political career is campaigning an election. And I don't have to tell this audience that in looking back at Senator Nunn's career for 24 years in the Senate, that there's also another part to this, and that's the part I'd like to try to distill this morning. Senator Nunn served at a time when there were far-reaching changes in domestic politics and in U.S. foreign policy. And as I looked at his career over that 24-year period, I broke it down for my own self into 3 periods. The first one from his election in 1972 until January of 1981. For the lack of a better term, I'll call that his apprenticeship. And it was a very brief apprenticeship, if I might add, not only in the Senate, but on the Senate Armed Services Committee, where I'm really focusing my attention, my work. It was short because, as Roland pointed out, this is a young man coming to a committee of which there are several other Democrats, Senator Stennis of Mississippi, Senator Scoop Jackson, others who you may be familiar with. But the average age, excluding Senator Nunn, of the Armed Services Committee when he came in 1973, was 63 years old. Senator Nunn became Chairman Stennis's eyes and ears, especially after Stennis was wounded in a robbery attempt in January 1973, and as we well know, by the 94th Congress, Senator Nunn was the chairman of the subcommittee on manpower and personnel. And I think there are 3 reports that he led that are really important in this period to show him gaining that expertise. The first is the 1974 NATO study, which he conducted at the behest of Chairman Stennis. The second is the 1975 study in which he went to Vietnam, again at the request of the chairman, to look at what was happening to a country that was falling apart. And perhaps more importantly, the 1976 study done with Senator Bartlett, Dewey Bartlett of Oklahoma, in which they looked at NATO again in a more complete manner and really initiated what was to become the conventional deterrence upgrades that occurred, starting with the Carter administration and drifting into the Reagan administration. I think that's a formative period. It is for any political leader, those first few years. Why? Because they're building competencies, and I see 3 of them right from this initial period. The first is technical, understanding the process, the procedures, the institution itself, understanding how one sees one's colleagues, social and political competence, understanding how legislative work. The second is interpersonal, negotiation, coalition building, communication, whether that's communication with colleagues, constituents, or the American public. And lastly, the third one is conceptual, understanding having a frame of reference about what the Cold War in 1973 and on looked like. Developing a mental map, if you will, understanding the issues that are competing for attention on the legislative agenda, trying to understand how the resources can be gotten a hold of, and articulating those strategic aims. By that period, at the end of that period, he had built a reputation. And it was one recognized not only by his colleagues, but also the executive branch and the media. The second period I would characterize as the period in which the Democrats are not in the majority, from 1981 to 1987. And I think there are two things that are very visible here. First of all, Senator Nunn's work on arms control, and particularly nuclear strategy, and the effect that he has on working on a bipartisan basis with the Republican majority, and I particularly want to note his work with Senator Warner of Virginia and Senator Cohen of Maine. And I think the second, even more lasting work in this partnership is the one he has with Barry Goldwater in 1986, in which they fashioned the legislation known as the Goldwater-Nichols Act. And though Senator Nunn's name does not appear on that legislation, as Jim Locker showed in his magnificent book, there is no doubt that it was also his endeavor as well. And then lastly, the third period. I'll take it from 1987 to 1994. He was chairman of the Senate Armed Service Committee. And in this period, I see this as the pinnacle of his political career as a veteran legislator, taking on new responsibilities in terms of the governing activity in the Senate and giving different meaning. Those technical, interpersonal, and conceptual competencies are in full view, whether it's the stewardship of the National Defense Authorization Act on a year-to-year basis, whether it's prompting the Bush administration, George Herbert Walker Bush, to begin to think about what should be the national strategy in terms of defense as the wall comes down in 1989, or the crowning achievement, as was mentioned earlier, the Nunn-Lugar Act, while the Soviet Union unravels in 1991. I believe it's his vision to see the criticality of controlling and disposing of the former Soviet Union's nuclear weapons and fissile material that's so important. So when one looks at Senator Nunn's career, his leadership is so very much apparent. But I contend that his leadership reaches beyond our common understanding of political leadership, for it is really an example of strategic leadership. And I'm defining that as the capacity to think, to act, and to influence in such a manner that promotes a sustainable competition and a competitive advantage for the United States in a global environment marked by threats and opportunities. I believe that Senator Nunn created a vision of what the United States should do to maintain the international order it preferred by aligning policy and resources through legislation and other means to promote that vision. And then by working within the institution of the Senate, but with the House, the Department of Defense and State, the White House, and internationally, to build consensus and thereby meet the challenges that the nation and its allies so much needed. I'll end where I began. While Dana Milbank may opine that there are no giants in the Senate today, leadership, national leadership, is context dependent. Even the Senate that Senator Nunn entered in 1972 was not the same Senate he left in 1996. However, the attributes of strategic leadership do not change. Leadership still demands well-developed competencies and the ability to apply them to a vision, to align that vision for a common purpose, and to build consensus to manage change. Thank you.
So the third member of or the fourth member of the panel, last and certainly not least, is Arnold Panaro. Arnold probably knows Sam as well as anybody that's worked with him, having spent a quarter century with him at the Senate Armed Services Committee as a director and as the staff director. And Arnold has also written an excellent book, which I think some copies of which have been distributed and which he'll draw on. But Arnold, thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege to join my colleagues. First of all, I grew up in Macon, Georgia. And out of college in '68, one of the peak years of the Vietnam War, I went into the United States Marine Corps, served as an infantry platoon commander in Vietnam, came back and went to the graduate school at the University of Georgia. And then what started as a 10-week internship for the recently elected Senator Sam Nunn turned into 24 years, and as Graham has mentioned, 14 of which were as staff director on the Armed Services Committee. But as Roland and I and all the Nunn staffers in the audience know, you never stop working for Senator Nunn. So since 1997, when he went into the private sector, and I did too, I've been working for him. So I've worked for Senator Nunn and known his family for about 45 years. So Graham is right, we've been around a long time. And Roland and I had the privilege, because I actually ended up being the assistant press secretary for a while, and Roland and I carpooled into work every day, so we told a lot of stories. In the early years, we went out to the Nunn's home on Tulip Hill Terrace, took pictures of the family, including Michelle and Brian when they were still in kindergarten and elementary school, and got to know the Nunn family, Betty and Jean, and the whole extended family over the years. And in the early years, Roland and I sometimes weren't real sure if we're on the right track, and if we wanted to find out if we were on the right track, we would call up Colleen Nunn and get the straight and narrow, and we'd call his mother, Mrs. Elizabeth Nunn, who, boy, she would really straighten you out. And then if Senator Nunn jumped on us, we could say, well, that's what Colleen told us to do. I want to talk a little bit about the enduring characteristics of Senator Nunn, and my colleagues have mentioned some of them. Frank made the point, bipartisan. And that's a really important word, because Senator Nunn will tell you there's nothing he did in Washington and nothing he does today that gets done on a partisan basis. It all gets done on a bipartisan basis, and you can go look through the history of that. He had a very close relationship with the Republicans on the committee, whether he was in the minority or in the majority and in the Senate. And he was chairman. He worked closely with Senator John Warner and also with Strom Thurmond, who was also a ranking minority member. And during his 14 years on the Armed Services Committee as either chairman or ranking member, there were only a handful of party line votes. I can only think, I tried to do some research, again, 2 or 3, most of them related to the Strategic Defense Initiative in early 80s. Also, when we took our bill to the Senate floor, it was the largest piece of legislation that passed the Senate every year. We would have hundreds and hundreds. I think Judge Andy Efron, our general counsel, is here. Andy and David Lyles and others had to get the amendments ready. 250, 300 amendments. They don't even vote on amendments in the Senate today, but back then they did. We had to deal with all of them. And in all the years Senator Nunn chaired the committee, and we brought a bipartisan position there, and we dealt with hundreds and hundreds of amendments. In 24 years, we only had 8 votes that we did not win. That's a pretty darn good track record. It was because we approached it on a... Senator Nunn was also not afraid to go against his own party. He convinced President Jimmy Carter to keep troops in South Korea. Jimmy Carter was actually the first president that talked about pulling our troops out of South Korea. Senator Nunn went over there firsthand for a firsthand look. Actually, President Carter had asked him to go over and meet with Deng Xiaoping in China. He just normalized relations. Senator Nunn got Bill Cohen, newly elected Republican Senator, John Glenn, our famous senator on the Armed Services Committee, Gary Hart. And we went and met with Deng Xiaoping to figure out China, but then we flew to South Korea to talk about the importance of troops in South Korea. He came back, of course he authored a report. You know, he wasn't Senator Nunn. We were on a plane coming back, we were writing a report. 530 drafts rolling, I think. Maybe not that many, at least 25 drafts. And he went down with the senators and convinced Carter to keep troops in South Korea, which remains important to this day. He had concerns about the SALT II treaty, and he used his concerns there to get President Carter to start increasing the defense budget. A lot of people don't realize, we all refer back to the Reagan defense buildup, but actually the defense buildup started in the Carter administration, and it started when President Carter invited Senator Nunn to come down to his Oval Office and talk to him about why we needed to increase the defense budget. And Senator Nunn gave a powerful pitch. I was privileged to be in that meeting, and Harold Brown was the Secretary of Defense. And at the end of the pitch, Carter looks over at Harold Brown and says, Harold, is Sam right? And the Secretary of Defense says, yes, Mr. President, he is right. We need to increase the defense budget. And that's when the real defense buildup started in the late 70s. And he was, by the way, all his time in the Senate in what we call then the respectable center. And that group determined the outcome of every vote in the Senate in that time frame. He had so bipartisanship in approaching everything on a substantive basis. The second trait that I want to talk about, total mastery of the substance. So before he would go on a Sunday talk show, and Kathy Gwynn and the other press folks and Roland, he got invited to go almost every week. He could have gone on the Sunday talk shows almost every week. We would prepare multiple briefing books, and I'm not just talking about one book, I'm talking about 2, 3, 4. And he'd read every single one of them, and he would eventually whittle that notes that he took on his yellow pads. And if you go to his library at Emory, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of these yellow pads. Now, the good news is you can't read his darn writing. I could, so I always figured I don't have a job. I'll be able to go read those yellow pads. And he would boil it down to one page, and then he'd fold that yellow page like this, and then he'd fold it in a quarter, and everything he was going to make was on that 1/4 of that yellow page. Roland remembers this. Frank mentioned he became an expert on NATO. He published 3 reports on NATO, authored legislation to strengthen NATO militarily, and at the same time, and this is the late 70s, early 80s, he was pushing NATO to pay more of their fair share of the burden of the common defense. So Sam Nunn was for making NATO allies pay more for their defense before it was cool to be in favor of it like it is now. Steve Rosenfeld, one of the great columnists for the Washington Post, wrote a column titled, How Sam Nunn Saved NATO, because he actually did in those early years. Frank mentioned the report on Vietnam Aid, the painful option, where Senator Nunn came back and argued the way we were running the war, Vietnamization, was not working, but we didn't want to desert the Vietnamese, and he made a case called Vietnam Aid, the painful option. And it went through multiple drafts, probably 15 or 20. We thought it was perfect. He said, send it out. Roland and I sent it out to everybody in the world that could read or write. And Senator Nunn, who read it about 10 times already, decided to read it again. He found one minuscule typo in a footnote. I'm not kidding. He calls up Roland. It says, Roland, there's a typo. We got to redo it. We can't send the report out with a typo. Senator, don't worry about it. It's already gone. You know, we sent out 5,000 copies to everybody in the world. No, Roland, you don't understand. We are not sending out a report with a typo. He said, Senator, nobody's going to read that footnote. Well, we lost that argument. So Roland and I go down to the giant Washington, D.C. massive post office, and all the Frank mail goes out in these orange bags. There were thousands of these orange bags. And so we go to the postmaster and say, hey, we got to pull back the Vietnam Aid, the painful options. You know, give us the orange bag. He says, I don't know what the hell's in those orange bags. Roland and I went through every damn one of those orange bags. We found almost every one of those reports. I said, hey, Roland, let's send one of them out with a typo just for the hell of it. So we did that. Senator Nunn was also results-oriented. As Frank mentioned, he didn't mind if others got the credit as long as the results were accomplished. Goldwater Nichols, the seminal landmark change in our military operational structure in 1986 to correct problems that had been identified starting in the late 70s and early 80s. He was the ranking member with Barry Goldwater, worked incredibly hard on these, and also at the same time, we had the Packard Commission headed by David Packard, making landmark recommendations for changes in the way we buy weapon systems. Well, Senator Nunn was the intellectual force behind both of those major changes, fundamentally changing our department on the operational side and the management side, but he stood back and let others take the credit. So it was named after Barry Goldwater and Bill Nichols in the House. So he always liked others to take the credit. He also convinced President Bush to provide the Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen when they were fighting the Soviets, and those weapons are the ones that drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Actually, Senator Nunn, Colleen was on this trip with us, went over to Pakistan to meet with the Mujahideen and the freedom fighters, they were called at the time. They were actually, as Senator Nunn observed, These people are not fighting for Jeffersonian democracy, they're fighting to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. They actually were today's Taliban. And as a Marine that had been in a couple wars, I thought to myself, boy, I sure wouldn't want to go up against those guys. But Senator Nunn came back and convinced President Bush, we need to give them the Stingers. That's what knocked down all their helicopters, knocked down their resupply ability, killed their logistics lines, and the Soviets, under Gorbachev, pulled the plug. And by the way, Charlie Wilson, the movie Charlie Wilson's War, he gets all the credit, but it was our committee, the Armed Services Committee, that rolled $250 million a year into the covert fund in Afghanistan under Senator Nunn's leadership. So Senator Nunn drove the Soviets out of Afghanistan. Thank you, Senator. He developed a global network of leaders throughout his career, military and civilian, and as Frank mentioned and Roland mentioned, he listens to people. One of the reasons we were able to hire such tremendous staff, and I know Roland and I would say the credit goes, Senator Nunn, to the great staff we had over the years, is because they wanted to work for Sam Nunn, because as they pointed out, he was thoughtful, he was objective, he made decisions which are in the best interest of the country because he listened to the experts. He would meet junior leaders from other countries and stay in touch with them as they rose through the ranks. A good example was the German parliamentarian Manfred Werner. Met him early in his career in the 70s. Manfred would later become the Minister of Defense of Germany, and they worked together. Then he became the Secretary General of NATO, and they worked together on improving NATO. Other examples over the years that Jim Schlesinger, Colin Powell, Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore. Senator Nunn was so respected. Lee Kuan Yew, as we all know, one of the great leaders of the world, one of the most respected leaders in the world. He came to Washington for a visit. The only person in the legislative branch he wanted to see was Sam Nunn. I'm not kidding. That was the only person. So he comes to Senator Nunn's office in Dirksen. I'm the staff director. Senator Nunn invites me there. We're sitting around Senator Nunn's round table. Capitol, you can see through the window. And the vote buzzer goes off, the vote clock. Senator Nunn didn't say a darn thing. He jumps up and he runs the vote. He's running out of the Prime Minister of Singapore, one of the world's greatest leaders, who's kind of never had that happen to him before. Here I am sitting by that round table, and there's a pregnant pause, and I'm thinking, what the heck, over? And I don't know what to do. And all I could think to say to Lee Kuan Yew, Prime Minister of Singapore, world's greatest leader, I went, how about them dogs? That's all I could think to say. And then I started explaining to the Prime Minister of Singapore about Georgia football. And he's looking at me like, who is this kumquat idiot? Senator Nunn votes, comes right back in and sits down like nothing ever happened. His foreign minister was named Donna Bala, and he was a friend of Senator Nunn's. And I was really worried because I said, oh my God, what have I done? And so I think he bumped into Donna Bala a couple of days later, and Donna Bala said something to Senator Nunn about it. He says, well, that was a pretty unique visit the Prime Minister did to one of the staffers. So anyway, well, listen, at least he knows about Georgia football. And today, look at who he's teamed with. Okay, wrap it up. I'm getting a... Kissinger, Schultz, Bill Perry, the Panama Canal vote, he took the tough votes. That was so unpopular in Georgia, he did the right thing and voted for it. 20 senators that voted for the Panama Canal lost their next election. That's how tough that vote was. And finally, let me just say, he always, unwavering support for the military and their families. He always wanted to talk to the enlisted troops to get the truth from the ground. And frankly, in doing that, he learned towards the end of the 70s, the all-volunteer force was going in the dirt. The all-volunteer force, which is the magnificent force we have today, was about to fail. Senator Nunn took action immediately, passed the Nunn-Warner benefits package, bipartisan thing, pay, C-pay, sub-pay, but the other thing he did was the Marine Corps and the Army in particular were having trouble with their quality standards. He mandated in law a certain percentage of high school graduates and a certain number of mental categories, and frankly, the focus on quality rather than quantity has stood with us today. 40 years later, those standards are still there, and I will tell you without question, and I know a lot of people in the military, I see some young officers from the Air Force here, still breathe love. General, they weren't there when we had quality problems. They're too young to have been there, but it was falling apart. I will tell you, not only did Sam Nunn save NATO, Sam Nunn Saved the All Volunteer Force. Thank you very much.
That's good.
So as you can,
Thank you.
I think as you can see, we could go on forever, but we're actually have only about 8 minutes, and we're going to have opportunities for questions from the audience. So Winston Churchill once observed that no great leader is a hero to his valet. So that may also be said in general of staffers who know very well people they have to serve. And I think it's actually a very interesting commentary, both Arnold and Roland, that they regard this as the greatest opportunity of their lives. So that's another just kind of suggestion about this human being and his family. So we have time for quick questions and short answers. So I have 20 questions, but I'm not going to ask mine. I'm going to defer to, please stand up, introduce yourself, and be quick. Right here, the lady. Yeah. No, this, right here. Please.
Ahead of him at the Carter Center Board of Counselors. And I had promised myself I'm going to get ahead of him someday. DK, my question is, and it's a comment. Senator Nunn was very brave and courageous in his vote for the Panama Canal Treaty. He was afraid that he would not be elected. And I know Colleen has told me that when they were on a parade one time, they said, we once had a canal and now we have none. But congratulations on this, on being such courage. And my question is, did you confer with Colleen before you did that decision?
Okay. So I appreciate the question. This was one of the few things in which I disagreed with Senator Nunn. I sided with Senator Hayakawa, who was the senator from California, and he said, give back the Panama Canal. We stole it, fair and square.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Please, and get the microphone.
Yeah, please get them. I don't need it, but it's okay.
You're good.
On. So I was going, it's not a question, it's a comment.
Please.
First of all, I think you can tell from my accent I'm from Alabama. So War Eagle. So the comment is that I know Sam Nunn did wonderful things. I have known him and his family for a long time. But I want to say that this group here, very influential people, I wish Sam runs today as a senator. We need him more in Senate today than we did in the past. Sam, we would like for you to run on Johnny Isaacson's seats. It's going to be vacant soon when he retires. So we will vote for you, we will work for you, and we need you there, Sam. Happy birthday.
Good. I think there's no question that there's a campaign committee here in this room. Arnold, yeah.
On the Panama Canal vote, I think it's very important to note that Senator Nunn added a reservation to that treaty, which is part of the Senate process, that allowed the United States of America, if it was in our national interest, to defend the canal in perpetuity. That was one of the reasons that he was able to ultimately vote for the treaty, because it allowed us, if we needed for our national security, to go back in. And by the way, you saw at one point we did have to invade Panama and take out Noriega, and Senator Nunn and I were privileged to fly down there and see that military operation there, led by General Max Thurman of the United States Army, and to see the loud music that they were blasting. The Noriega hid in the Papal Nuncio's house, and Senator Nunn and I also went and visited Noriega's home, and he had all these voodoo dolls and stuff in there. So the good news is he's locked up in prison for the rest of his life.
Good footnote. Please, floor is still open for comments or questions. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, we give people, I have 20 questions, so let's just see if there's somebody else to give you an opportunity. Please, don't be shy. Yes? Okay. let me go back then. I'll do one while we're ad-libbing for a second, okay, because for my list. If you look back over Sam Nunn's career, would you identify any major mistake that he made in retrospect? I know this is almost inconceivable. Oh, Sam says, time's over, we're done. Yeah. Please.
Well,
Other than the hiring of some staff.
Yeah. That was a big mistake when they kept me on for 24 years. I would say the first Gulf War was a very, very difficult issue in the United States Senate. And Senator Nunn, as chairman, did his usual thing. He had extensive hearings.
Wait, Arnold, just do a footnote, because many people here will not know what was the first Gulf War or when.
So August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, took over Kuwait. September 1990, the United States Marine Corps 1st Marine Division deployed to the sands of Saudi Arabia. We got there months before the United States Army showed up, thank you. But Bush was deciding whether or not we were going to go to war with Iraq. Senator Nunn was the chairman. He had extensive hearings on it, traveled to the region. I actually got called up as a Marine reservist, deployed over there, went over there and got a firsthand look, and then was brought back home. And what I did not know at the time when I was called up, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Al Gray, one of our greatest warfighters, was so worried about the casualties, he wanted me to go over there, firsthand talk to the Marine commanders who had the brunt of the attack through the Iraqi forces in January 1991 about the casualties. Colin Powell, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was quietly telling Senator Nunn behind the scenes, make the sanctions work longer. General Schwarzkopf, the commander of our forces on the ground, telling Senator Nunn the same thing. Jim Schlesinger, former Secretary of Defense. So Senator Nunn had a resolution when Bush doubled the size of the force to actually have the sanctions work 4 or 5 months longer to see if that would get Saddam Hussein to pull his forces back so we wouldn't have to commit American lives and treasure. And that was debated in the Senate. It lost by 4 votes. And then the other resolution to authorize the use of force passed. And I think our recommendation to Senator Nunn, and he and I have talked about this before many times, was that he should vote for the second resolution to authorize the use of force, so we would be united as a country in basically taking him out of Kuwait as we needed to do. And I think Senator Nunn has said in some interviews that he's done that it probably was a mistake to not vote for that second resolution. But I would say to my dying day, he was absolutely right on the one that he sponsored, that we should make the sanctions work longer, because every single military leader and every civilian leader that we respected felt like we should try to do that to protect the lives of our U.S. service personnel.
Extremely good summary of a very complicated history, but absolutely. I don't know, do either of you want to say something about that?
No.
This mistake or others?
I would start with one. It might be a long list, but no, I can't think of it.
Okay. Again, the floor is still open if people have questions. I don't want to be, we've got, I think they've extended us to 12:45, so we have 7 more minutes. In the back?
Hello, is this on?
Please.
My name is Vassar Seidel. I am Laura Turner Seidel daughter and the granddaughter of Ted Turner. And my question, looking around the room, and I think I might be the youngest person here. I don't know. I see a lot of young faces. But what would your message be to the younger generation? Just because we live in a tough political time, and I think a lot of people might be a little disfranchised by the political system in our democracy after the 2016 turnout. That is very clear. But also now we see young people more active than ever. So what would your one message be?
Don't give up. Ben Franklin is one of my favorites of the founding fathers. I'll quote him every day. He gave us the 5 most important words the founders ever uttered. You have a republic. The 5 words are, if you can keep it. He knew from the beginning that it was fragile, that it would be difficult. All that balance of powers was built into it, but each one had to be able to maintain its own integrity. And so And then Jefferson, I think, was the one that got in. At least they attribute to him saying that an informed citizenry, and somebody paraphrased it, an informed electorate is a requisite for the survival of a free people. And so I would say to today's young people, get informed. You say, well, that's not possible for me not to be informed. There's so many media outlets now and so many places where you can get information, and I would say, yeah, the wrong information. It's important for you to be able to discern what is true and what isn't. And well, how do I know? Well, use your head. That's what you really have to do, because there's no way. You know, Ted Turner's down here, he knows about all of this, that when we came to the Senate, there were 2,000 accredited reporters covering the Senate. They were accredited in the Senate gallery. When Russell was there, Charlie Campbell's here, was with Russell, they probably had about 300 or 500 max, and that sounds like a lot. Until you look at today, there are 6,800 people who are accredited in the Senate press gallery. So there's no shortage of people covering and reporting the news. What we don't have is people being aware of what the news means. And they need, today's young people have a chance to reset this thing, because right now we've broken it badly. Okay. Sorry, too long.
I would quickly summarize: serve a cause greater than yourself, and we will keep this republic.
Right. So unless I see another hand, I'll do one of my questions, but I'm giving you an opportunities. Going, gone. Okay, so if you look at the period when Sam entered the Senate, and you look when he left the Senate, and you take the issue of polarization. Yeah. One of the points that everyone emphasized is that polarization was not part of the Nunn vocabulary. Bipartisanship was.
Right.
So do we see in the period the seeds of the polarization that we see today, or what?
The seeds of the polarization, I think, came to us in about 1978, when a series of people were elected who said no compromise, no cooperation. That was in 1978, but we recorded a television program with the majority leader, Mike Mansfield, when towards the end of Senator Nunn's first term, I'd say about 77, something like that, and we interviewed people who were cabinets in Carter's administration and leadership in the Congress. One of them was Mansfield. I'll never forget that. He had the best comment, best lesson in it for today's young people who are trying to learn from all of this. Senator Nunn asked him the question, now, Mike, how do you make your mind up as to who's going to get a chance to speak and which issues are going to come forward first and what the agenda is going to be for the day? And he said, well, Sam, you know there are 100 senators. They're all duly elected by their states. They all come here with their own ideas and opinions and their own issues to push forward. And in my opinion, they're all equal, all have merit in what they say. And so I look at all 100 senators as equals. Well, we've come a long way from that, I think.
So, Graham, I think in the early years, the veterans, the senators that had served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Strom Thurmond, Bob Dole, Danny Inouye, John Warner, John Glenn, John McCain, many, many others, had served this cause greater than themselves. And the great privilege Senator Nunn and I had, and Roland and the staff that was here, when we bring that bill with 300 amendments, if it was Howard Baker or Bob Dole on the other side leading the minority or the majority, they wanted to cooperate and they wanted to make things happen, because you didn't push these veterans around. I mean, Strom Thurmond, people have talked about him, but he flew into the Normandy invasion in a glider, and I mean, he was a World War II vet, and he always looked at doing the right thing for the country. And frankly, I think if we got more veterans in the Senate and the House, things might be a little different now.
Yeah.
Can I speak to that? The studies that have been done recently suggest that the seeds were there in the 1970s and it became more and more prevalent over the 80s and into the 90s. Sean Thorold, who's a professor at the University of Texas, has done a study on this. One of the other perhaps influences in changing the folkways, the norms of the institution itself is the fact that he argues that members of the House, who had been House Republicans under speakership of Newt Gingrich, brought a certain way of looking at the world, I'll just say it that way, into the Senate that had an effect on the norms and the culture itself of the institution. That's perhaps a debatable point, but I think Thoreau makes a good argument that that had an impact on how the Senate functions.
So last question.
Thank you. My name is Peter Lauer. I'm the senator's nephew through marriage. Did I say that right? Yes. There was a rumor back in the '08 campaign that he and Michael Bloomberg were exploring a run for president, vice president, and didn't do it, but they had the 19% Ross Perot voters from the '92 election as sort of the target audience, and then sought to expand it from there. They didn't end up running. To this day, I've thought, boy, I wish they had run. I'd be curious, and I've at times chatted with the senator about that, but I'd be curious your thoughts about, from the standpoint of the good of the country.
Any quick thoughts?
I went with him out to Oklahoma when Bloomberg and Senator Nunn and about 17 other senators, former and present, members of House and Senate, as a matter of fact, we were in this group. They had a meeting the night we were there. I was so tired I don't think I remember too much about it, but I do remember that the group sitting around the table, hardly anyone there said, you know, when I served, I cannot remember a major bill that I worked on or voted on or that passed that did not have bipartisan support from the outset. Isn't that about right, Senator? Did I remember that correctly? But it's a shame that I think they met there thinking that somebody in that group would probably run as an independent that year. But Obama was already beginning to make some waves, like he was going to be the one guy to consider and to be considered. That it didn't happen. It didn't happen. But it was, that's all I remember, is that it was an opportunity to produce somebody that could have been a significant. I don't know if it could have gotten over 19%. That was always the big question. That was the Perot number. And boy, if you could crack 20, then you were rolling. I think.
But the bottom line is, your point is well taken. We need to bring what I call the respectable center back to American politics. Sam Nunn was the embodiment of that.
Unfortunately, we've come to the witching hour of this session. Let me remind you now what's going to happen. We have a quick buffet lunch, and at 1:35, we're going to continue this conversation with Ambassador Gordon Giffen and a great panel looking at some other dimensions of Sam's leadership.
Great.
I was at a brainstorming discussion at Harvard this past week on an interesting new book on the Marshall Plan, which was, again, one of the great moments in American statecraft, with Ben Steele, the author. It's a great read. I'd recommend it. And in the course of the conversation, we were trying to ask the question, but for which the question I asked before, this wouldn't have happened. So in the absence of what human beings' activity, would there never have been a Marshall Plan, and then all the stuff that follows from that? And the answer was that there's several, but most significantly, Arthur Vandenberg, who was the Republican senator, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, and the message of what he did in 1948 in supporting the Marshall Plan, which meant that he would not get the nomination to be the Republican candidate. And then not becoming Secretary of State for Truman because he wanted to stay chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in order to shepherd this program. So it wouldn't have happened. So I would say we're extremely fortunate to be present with a senator for whom, in the absence of whom, lots of wonderful things that happened for the country wouldn't have happened. So let's say thank you very much.
Yeah, that's true. That's very true.
Graham, Thank you. Thank you all. Let's thank our whole panel for their. One of the important things to note about the senator, and I talked about leadership by example earlier, is that it is possible to have enormous impact, lasting impact, and inspirational impact outside of the office as it has been inside the office.